Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Guns and Guitars. Now this video is one that you guys have been begging me to do for a long time. I did a little bit of a teaser in that Stratocaster build that I did, the collaboration with Guitar Max, if you guys saw that. I installed a FLOYD ROSE Tremolo system inside of a Strat style guitar kit, and I said that I was going to be doing a full tutorial on how to do that, and then I lost all the footage of me installing the FLOYD ROSE into that guitar. So I had to redo it for you guys, so here I am. I have a new FLOYD ROSE that I'm going to install into this guitar, and I'll tell you more about it when we get started. I'm Dan, this is Guns and Guitars, so let's get started. So here I have a old beat up Squier Affinity Stratocaster that I'm going to be installing that FLOYD ROSE Tremolo system into. In fact, I am going to do a full build up of this guitar. You guys have been asking me for a while to do a full high-end build out of a cheap guitar as opposed to starting with a raw guitar kit. So that's what I'm doing here. But for now, I've stripped the finish off, mostly close enough to where I can see the bare wood, and that's good enough for now. I'll take care of the rest later. But I wanted to show you guys how to install that FLOYD ROSE because I promised that I would. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're gonna do is install the locking nut piece into the neck. And I'll go ahead and show you how that's done right now. Probably not gonna be able to hear me over that air conditioner, but you can try. I'm gonna sweat my balls off if I don't have that air conditioner running. Okay, so obviously you can see here, we're not gonna be able to install our locking nut piece with that wood right there. So we're gonna have to knock this wood off. And I found the best way to do that is actually just with a razor blade. So we're gonna kind of cut down and chip it off just a little bit at a time, just like that. You don't have to worry about going too deep here because if we end up going too deep for our nut piece, then we can always just shim it up with some pieces of aluminum can or some cardstock. Also works pretty good. So being pretty liberal with my removing of the material here because I'm more concerned about getting a nice flat surface for that to rest on than I am about the actual depth at which we need to set this. But there's a good chance that it's still going to be too high once we get a nice flat surface right here. So that thing will sit in right there. It's not going to be a perfect match. It's going to overlap a little bit. Obviously this is way too high, so we are going to have to remove quite a bit more. But, you know, no one's going to know that that overlaps except for you and me and everyone else. So it's not that big a deal if everyone knows because they're already going to know. So let's go ahead and remove some more of that material. So what we're looking for as far as height is when we have a string that's pinched on this second fret here, we want it to barely clear this first one by like a millimeter or less. So when I put this down here, I can see that our gap is kind of more like 3 millimeters. So we're going to have to come down a bit more on this nut piece. Looking a little better. We'll call that good for now. Now, to find where exactly to place our screws, we want to make sure this thing is perfectly centered on the neck because this is actually wider than a typical Strat nut piece. And so to put it correctly on the neck, we're going to have some overlap on both sides. And I don't necessarily want to guess at that, just eyeball it, because I don't want to end up with one string hanging off and the other one's just kind of being off-centered. So I measured these two screw holes. They are about 9/16 of an inch apart. And then I measured this distance right here, and we have 1 inch and 9/16. So that's pretty easy math. If we want a 9/16 gap in the middle and we have 1 inch and 9/16, that means we're going to have 1 inch left over. So divide it by 2. We should be able to just come in a 1/2 inch on both sides, and that should center us pretty good. So we're going to come in exactly a 1/2 inch right here. And then we'll come in exactly a 1/2 inch. Okay, in theory, that's going to be centered. So if I line up my 2 holes on those 2 lines, that's going to be exactly centered. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reach down my pencil and just kind of mark exactly where we want to drill. So that's where I'm going to pre-drill my screw holes right there on those two lines in the exact spot right there. And that should get us perfectly centered. Now you really do need to pre-drill your screw holes because these screws, I'm assuming, that came with my really cheap Floyd Rose are going to be really terrible and strip out really easy. So I'm going to pre-drill with as close to the exact same size drill bit as that screw, leaving just enough overlap for those threads to go in. Okay, and I'm also going to tape off at the exact depth that I want. All right, that should be good. All right, and that is locked down perfectly. And as you can see, that is perfectly centered. Looks like I shouldn't have an issue getting clearance for either of my E strings on those frets. So I highly recommend you guys take the time to do the measurements as opposed to just trying to eyeball it, because if you eyeball it, there's a good chance, I mean, even if you're off by like a 32nd of an inch, that is going to mean drastic ramifications on your string spacing on the fretboard. So I highly recommend you take the time to do the measurements, do the math the way I did, and just find out where to put those two screws perfectly centered. Okay, now that I have the nut piece in place there, I've reattached the neck to the body, and now we can measure where we're going to put our new bridge tremolo. Okay, so to measure where we're going to place this bridge, we're first going to find our scale length. This is just like placing any other guitar bridge, by the way. Oh good, my mic cable's hanging in the camera view. So we're going to measure from the nut piece to the 12th fret, and as you can see, that is 12 3/4 inches. So double that, and that's your scale length. So we've got a 25.5 inch scale. Now for guitar, I typically like to add about 1/4 of an inch, and that usually lands me pretty close to where I'm going to be intonated. And I like to do that for guitar. Bass saddles typically have a lot more adjustment, so there's a little bit more room for error. Guitar saddles don't have as much room for error, and I found that 1/4 of an inch kind of lands you pretty close to where you want the center for where your strings are going to be intonated properly. So I'm going to measure both sides of the neck here for 25 3/4, so because 25.5 is our scale, add 1/4 of an inch, and that's where we want our saddles to be. Okay, and to find center, there's a couple ways to do it. You can either align your straight edge with your neck and mark like that, which I've done that pretty successfully most of the time. So I'll go ahead and do that right now, but then I'm going to show you probably the way that I'm the most successful. I've got some pencil markings. They're about where I'm going to put my bridge saddles as well as centered for my bridge. Place our bridge on there. Whereabouts I think it's going to go. All right, you see that? So we got clearance there on that string. Then we come over here to the other E string and pretty good clearance. If anything, it needs to go this way just a smidge. So, but I am blocked from doing that because we have this little arm here for the tremolo where it screws down. As you can see on the Strat style, it doesn't really have that extra piece hanging off there. So we are going to have to clear out some room for that piece, and I usually just use my Dremel to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and remove just a little bit of material from there. I'm going to go ahead and pencil exactly kind of the area that I was thinking. I'm going to remove from there. Probably could have used a router for that, but seriously, how easy was that just now? All right, so put this guy back up in kind of where I was thinking. All right, so now it looks like my E is kind of getting close to the edge there. And I have a bit more clearance on that E. So I'm going to split the difference actually, maybe like that. And if you're going to eyeball it, this is the best way to eyeball it. Actually using your string. Because if anything, I'd probably like to have a little more clearance on my high E than my low E, just so I can get my finger on there to do those pitch bends and things. So that looks pretty good. I don't think I'm going to change anything else. So real quick, before I lose this position, I'm going to go ahead and trace the sides of my bridge here. All right, and then I'm going to measure for that scale length again, because I think I moved back a little bit. 25, and I did move back a little bit, so I need to go a little bit more forward. So that's 25 3/4 where the string is going to rest on the saddle. And that's what I'm looking for. Okay, so now we got it centered, we got our scale length marked. Now we're going to go ahead and just trace the whole dang thing. We do need a little extra clearance there in the back to make sure that these little tuning things don't bottom out. All right, and that right there is where we are going to route for our tremolo. But we're not going to route there yet. We're going to drill for our post mounts first. All right, and I did notice just now that when I put my tremolo in the exact spot that I want it, this part kind of rubs up against the heel right there. So I'm actually going to remove a little bit of that material right there, same way I did before, just with my Dremel tool. Plenty of clearance there now. Now, as you can see, not only did I trace out where I'm going to route, but I also traced out where I'm going to drill for those post holes right here and right here. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because we don't have a lot of material before this cavity right here. So once we drill that out, there's just going to be a little tiny thin piece of not very sturdy wood, and there's going to be a lot of tension from that Floyd, especially when we're slamming on that whammy bar. We don't want this wood to blow out right here, so we're going to have to do some reinforcement. All right, and to reinforce this area right here, first I'm going to need to strip off a little bit of the finish that I didn't strip off from the inside of the cavity, because we are going to be using some wood glue and we want some actual wood for it to stick to. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick with a Dremel. I'm going to take off as little as possible. I don't want to remove any wood, I just want to remove the paint. So as you can see, we are down to the bare wood right there. And so to reinforce it, we're going to use a couple of things. We're going to use some wood glue. So this stuff right here, titebond, this is the best wood glue because this stuff dries harder than the actual wood itself. So your wood is going to fail before the glue fails, which is awesome. So we'll be using some of that. And we're also going to be using some metal. I've got these metal hangers right here, and I'll actually show you. These are called Sawtooth hangers. And I've just had these laying around from a previous do-it-yourself project, but they're really cheap at your hardware store. They're just for like hanging picture frames and stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of those and I'm going to flatten them out here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to install them like this. So I'm going to bend this one around like that. And I'll do another one right below it. Go ahead and bend that one down there like that. And this is the way I did it for the other Strat video, the collaboration with Max. And it held surprisingly well. I didn't have any issues with the wood blowing out. In fact, I had drilled on that Strat, I had drilled my post holes just a tad too small. So when I hammered the post holes in, I actually got a little bit of splitting in the wood. It didn't quite make it all the way there, and I assume that that's because I had reinforced it so well. But even, once that was set, I put a little extra wood glue on that crack, and then with the wood glue and the metal hangers in there, I had no issues diving down on that Floyd without any blowouts of any kind. So I know that the method does work. Okay, so to attach these, last time I just used the finishing nails that came with them. This time I have some little screws that I'm going to use instead, just for a little extra reinforcement. I don't have any reason to believe that the finishing nails wouldn't hold just fine, especially when we coat the whole thing with glue. I think they will hold just fine, but just for a little extra support, I'm going to use these tiny little screws. Okay, so this first one I'm going to place kind of as close to the top pretty much as I can, and that's going to be sort of our main support brace, if you will. You can probably hear my kids screaming out there. That's fine. My wife's with them, I promise. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark where those holes are going to go. All right, so that looks pretty good. Okay, as you can see now, I've backed these out a little bit, so there's a nice gap there. I'm going to put some wood glue in there, let it seep down, let it get all over those screws, and then I'm going to thread them back in. And that is as reinforced as I want it to be, I think. Now we're going to do something a little bit different for this side, because this side, obviously that would be a really aggressive angle, and having something wrap around, it's not going to give us the same strength as it does when they're wrapping around in this angle. So right here, we're actually just going to glue in some extra wood right there to kind of reinforce it. And I'm going to glue in more than I need, and then I'll just go back with my Dremel and kind of clear out what might be getting in the way of this pickup. This is 1/8 inch plywood. This is the same stuff that I use to make my pickguard and humbucker rings. And this is just scrap that I have laying around. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to round this edge a little bit, probably with my Dremel or a file or something. And we're going to glue that right in there. And then I'm going to do it again with a little bit smaller piece, even more so into that corner. So we're going to reinforce this corner really good. So now we've got a good fit right there for that. I just need to measure and cut off the portion that I'm going to need. All right. So you can see I cut that curve right there to match, so that when it goes up in there, it is in fact a perfect match for that curve. So I'm going to do the same thing for one more piece. Wood glue, wood glue, wood glue. Apply liberally. Putting the pressure on there with the clamp. Wipe away the excess there. All right, as you can see, I just piled it in there with some wood glue. When that dries, should be plenty sturdy. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and let this sit overnight, let that glue dry up nice and cured, and then tomorrow we will drill for the post holes. Okay, and this is the section that I forgot to plug in my microphone, so I'm going to give you a quick voiceover after play-by-play. That there is a barbecue wood skewer. I'm going to use that to fill up this hole. So I'm just going to cut off a little piece and a little dab of glue, and then hammer it down in there. So glob on that glue there, hammer, 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 wipe away the excess, and repeat just a few more times. Blah, 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 glue, hammer, wipe, extra excess. Dremel, best tool ever. Gonna sand really lazily. All done. Okay, now we're at the drill press, and as you can see, I'm not using the actual size drill bit that I need. I'm drilling a pilot hole with an 1/8 inch drill bit. Actually, you can't even see because I'm blocking it with my arm. So good job filming this, Dan. Way to go. So drilling a couple pilot holes with an 1/8 inch drill bit. Now I'm going to go back with my 3/8 drill bit, and you can see I marked my depth with the blue tape there. I don't use the depth gauge on my drill press because I don't really know how to use it. So, all right, guys, here is the moment of truth. We've got our holes drilled for our posts. Now it's time to hammer it in, and I wanted this to be a little bit looser fit than it is. It's turning out to be a pretty snug fit. I don't want to blow out this spot right here. So I'm just going to lightly kind of tap on it to see if it's going to go in easy. And if it doesn't, then I might take that same drill bit and just kind of go in and out to widen the hole just a slight amount. Yeah, I think that's going to be a bit too tight. Good grief, that's in there tight. Ugh. Now that'd be perfect. You can see I even pulled up a little bit of the finish with it. It's okay. We're going to be scraping off the rest of that finish anyway. So you can see how tight that was. And on a normal guitar, that'd be perfect. But on a Strat, we're being careful not to put any cracks in it. So with just that little bit of wood right there, we could split it and crack it pretty easily. So we are going to need just a slightly larger hole. You will notice that I do mark my drill bits with tape when I'm trying to get a specific depth, even when I'm using my drill press. And that's because even though my drill press has a depth gauge, I don't know if I'm just an idiot, but sometimes I mess up using the depth gauge and I get the wrong depth. But this method is idiot proof. You just measure your depth and then tape it off there and you can't really screw it up. All right. I bet that's going to be better now. Let's go ahead and try hammering that in. That looks good. That looks successful. That looks like we didn't split it at all. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do the same thing right here because we have a lot less wood right there, so we definitely don't want to split right there. All right, that's about as flush as it gets. So as you can tell, we didn't get any splitting as we drove those in, which is good, especially right here. It's a really thin piece. So the reinforcement there is helping, and that's especially going to be useful, these reinforcements, when the Floyd is loaded up under the tension of the springs and the strings, and we're going to be slamming on it with the whammy bar. That's what that reinforcement is really for. But it was good of us to double check that these aren't going to split, because that means that this is going to be a very sturdy Floyd Rose installation. Alright, so I've installed the neck again, and I'm going to go ahead and put in my screws for my posts. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set up the Floyd on the screw posts with the screws adjusted at the full minimum height. Okay, that's the screws all the way in. The reason I'm going to do that is when I set up my Floyd here, first I'm going to check for the string spacing to make sure that didn't fit, but I'm also going to be checking for string height. Now this neck, when I pulled it out, it actually did have a shim in it, so I know that my string height is going to be too tall overall, but I want to see how much more height is added by the Floyd, because what I'm going to do is, instead of shimming the neck, I'm actually going to route to sink the bridge in deeper. In this style of bridge, you will need to route it anyway, because if you look at it, on the bottom here, these tuning things, they don't sit flush with the actual Floyd. So your Floyd won't sit perfectly level unless you route out for that anyway. So we're going to need to route for this Floyd one way or another. It doesn't matter if we shim the neck or not. So, but we're going to see our string height. However much we need it to come down, that's how much we're going to route for our Floyd. That way we don't have to shim the neck, and then I can do those 45-degree angle support screws for the neck and body like I always do, which you can't do if you shim your neck. So I got this installed, and it looks like it's in the right spot, but we'll go ahead and double check with a string. So that string has plenty of room there on the fret, and so does this. So we are perfectly centered still, so perfect. That means my drill bit didn't walk at all. Now let's look at the string height. We'll call it 3/16. 3/16 we're going to route. 3/16. Final answer. Okay. Alright, before we route it out, I'm going to go ahead and trace exactly where our Floyd's going to be. Now that we've set our post, we have an exact placement. And I'm going to use a fine tip Sharpie because I don't want the pencil to smudge as I'm running the router. So that's exactly where I have to route. As you can see, this line's a little bit screwy. That's because of these little things that are sticking out at the top there, the little tuning things. I'm not sure why those stick out so much. I'm guessing so it gets more leverage or something when you're tuning, but it's weird to me that they're all uneven. Anyway, I think it's going to look better if we just go straight across. So that's what I'm going to do here. That is how we are going to route for the Floyd. That's going to be our first route, and that's going to be, we're going to take off 3/16 of an inch, and then I'm going to go back, I'm going to take off a little bit more, again like I showed you for these bottom little points that are sticking out. We'll take out just right here in the middle so that we can let this thing sit flush. That way we can set it up to be a dive-only tremolo if we want to, and it won't mess with the tuning. Okay, we're ready to route out. I've set up my plunge router with a depth of 3/16 of an inch. Now, you don't need a plunge router for this, but I picked up this plunge router on Facebook Marketplace for $40, so it makes it the same price as my little Harbor Freight trim router here that I've been using. Runs about $35, $40. And this thing works awesome, and I still use it from time to time when I'm too lazy to trade out my bit, and this one already has the bit that I want to use. I'll just pull this one out and use it. But I'm going to go ahead and use this one just because it's better, and it cost me the same price. And then I've got my shop vac here on standby so I can suck out the wood chips as they go flying. I'm going to put on some hearing protection too, so I won't be able to hear you guys. Not that I can hear you guys anyway because I'm talking into a camera. Alright, so now we've got a nice pretty clean looking Floyd route. It's probably not my best work. I just freehanded it. Obviously I didn't use a template, but that fits in nice and good. We've got a little bit of play in there, which is good because we want to make sure we're not having any hangups at all whatsoever. So if you look closely right here, and I'll try to hold it up so the camera can see better, this right here is not the cleanest I've ever done. It should look like a straight line. It looks far from it. So this one back here, not super straight either. The other ones don't look too bad. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my Dremel and just kind of clean those up a little bit so they look a little nicer. I know, I'm using my Dremel to fix something again. Big surprise. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the description to the exact Dremel and flex shaft kit that I'm using here. We'll probably end up putting a link in the description to just about everything you'll need for this. But as you guys are finding out, this is the handiest tool in my workshop. I use it all the time. Alright, that looks much cleaner. Now the last thing I'm going to do that I mentioned before, these tuner things on the bottom stick out below where the tremolo wants to sit flush in its route. So I'm going to route out an additional 1/8 of an inch on top of the 3/16 that I already did. And I'm going to just go ahead and kind of freehand trace what that's going to look like. And if this route doesn't come out perfect, it's not going to be the end of the world because it's going to be completely hidden under the tremolo. So again, I just want that so that we can set this as a flush mount, dive only tremolo without having any issues with tuning. So actually, now that I think about it, we're going to route out more than 1/8 of an inch because as you twist these in, those move down quite a bit. So I'm actually going to go ahead and adjust this to max, but we're going to want more than 1/8 of an inch now that I think about it. Yeah, we're actually going to want 1/4 of an inch, believe it or not. So 1/4 of an inch will allow us to have complete max adjustment. And this is where it's just important to understand how a Floyd Rose tremolo system works in order to install it correctly. If I were to install this flush, then first of all it wouldn't be flush, but then secondly, if I wanted to tune up my string tighter, it would start pushing the whole tremolo forward, which would not only not make that string higher in pitch, but would also detune the rest of them. So it's important to understand how the Floyd Rose tremolo system works in order to install it properly. And let's test. So I lied, and we are going to need to route all the way down to there, and I'll show you why. Because while I was concerned about the tuning springs here on the bottom because they protrude the furthest, these things actually at max tuning height, they actually go below the depth right there as well. So we are going to have to route all the way back to make sure that all of these clear as well. This has got to be the weirdest looking Floyd route I've ever done. I don't remember my last Floyd installation being nearly this complicated, so I think this specific one just requires a little bit more love for whatever reason. So that original bit that I routed out right there before I had to go all the way to the back, I actually ended up needing to route it out again a little bit deeper because once I routed this out, then those tuning springs sat a little bit deeper. So now it finally has a perfect flush mount, even with these two tuners, as you can see, are just sitting at their full depth right there. So now I can do a nice flush mount, dive only if I want, or I can always, loosen the spring tension enough so that it will float, be a floating tremolo. This is not an actual Floyd Rose. It's not even a licensed Floyd Rose. It is a cheap Chinese knockoff that I got on Amazon for 20 bucks. It says Overlord of Music, but it was supposed to be Music Lily. So I don't know. I don't know if this thing's going to be any good. I literally just bought it so that I could do this video for you guys. Put a link in the description if you guys are interested in buying one. But I had to do quite a bit more routing for this particular design than I did for the Speedloader one that I got from Guitar Fetish. So I remember the Speedloader one, all I did was route the actual Floyd shape about 1/8 of an inch deep, and that was it. That's all I needed to do. So this I needed to do 3 different steps to go down. So I started at 3/16 of an inch, and then I went down an additional 1/4 of an inch, and then an additional 1/8 of an inch is what I did there. So Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and put the post back in. I still have the neck attached so I can check for my string height to make sure it's good, but hopefully we are done with the routing at this point. Those are in as flush as can be, and that is sitting in there nice and perfect. Cool. About perfect, actually. So we're sitting just above the fret by a hair. It's going to be a lower action than we actually want, so we can come up a little bit, which is nice. Just check over here. Same thing, actually touching the fret over there. So that's good. So we'll be able to just bring the tremolo up exactly how we want it. The route ended up being a pretty good height, so it sits almost perfectly level. I mean, it probably sticks up maybe a 1/16 of an inch. But the Floyd sits nice and pretty level in there, which I actually really like. That looks a lot better than oftentimes you see Floyds that are sitting way up like this. And they look just awful. So I like this look much better. It's much cleaner. I actually don't mind the look of that Floyd, the way it sits in there so nice and snug. So that's perfect. So, all right, now let's get on with the installation. Sorry, that route took forever. So now we're going to set up our spring claw on the back. Just go ahead and flip this guy over. And as you know, the spring claw is going to go in there just like that. And here's the spring claw that came with my kit. Got a little damage during shipping. It's kind of a piece of junk. So I'm actually just going to use the spring claw and the mounting screws that were already on this guitar for the other tremolo. So I already know that the holes are pre-drilled for these screws, so why not? So we'll go ahead and stick those in here. And we'll go ahead and take the springs that came with our kit. So obviously it needs the strings also to balance out that string tension. But now we can screw in our tremolo arm. And we got our nice full dive Floyd Rose Tremolo. Alright, one thing that I nearly forgot to tell you guys about is that because this is a Stratocaster style guitar, we don't have the slanted headstock that you typically see on Ibanez style guitars. So what we're going to need to install is a little string retainer bar. And these are really cheap. I'll put a link in the description. I think you get 2 of them for a couple bucks. And we're just going to install it something like that so that when we string up our guitar, the strings are going to go down under that retainer bar to hold the tension right there. That way, because otherwise, if they just went straight to the tuners, especially these higher strings, there's not a whole lot pinching it down, so that when we clamp down our locking nut piece, it would actually pull it out of tune. So you want the retainer bar there to prevent that from happening. So real quick, I already marked where I want my holes to go. I'm just going to pre-drill. Basically, we just want our retainer bar to sit a little bit lower than the actual nut piece itself. So that's going to be plenty low to retain our strings. So there we go. Now everything is installed and I can string it up and test it out. All right, so here I am 2 years later, because that's how long it takes you to string up a Floyd Rose tremolo system. Let's try that again. Anyway, it's not in perfect tune, but close enough that I have a nice balanced string tension between the springs, so you can see you get that full dive down to floppiness and then back up. So we can totally dive bomb the heck out of this thing, and it's not putting any extra stress, it looks like, on our reinforced areas, so that's good. So nice gentle vibrato, no problem. And then dive bomb to nothing, no problem. So there you have, complete Floyd Rose Tremolo system installation in a Stratocaster style guitar.